Okay, so how do you bring the two lines, the one from Matthew and the one from Luke, all back to Jesus? How do they meet there?
Yeah, that's a great question because Joseph can't have two different fathers.
Yeah.
But using the same exact sort of thinking, I did something like this. Now I'm skipping over a lot of generations because there's too many to list here. But we have this puzzle with Jeconiah. We kind of solved that. But Zerubbabel, this famous governor of Judah, has two different sons in Luke and in Matthew. But again, Matthew's tracing the kingship. If Matthew's tracing the kingship, goes from Zerubbabel to Abiud, then 6 more generations to a man named Eleazar. But Luke goes to a man named Risa, and then 15 generations to a man named Mathan. But it's really interesting. If you look at Matthew and Luke, Joseph's grandfather in one is Mathan, and in the other is Mathat. That sounds like the same name, as if Mathan and Mathat really are the same person. So what if Eleazar died without a son? Well, the kingship, they got to find who's the king. Oh, it's this guy named Mathan. But then Mathan in Matthew and Luke has 2 different sons. One is Jacob and one is Heli. Okay, maybe those really are his sons. And maybe Jacob didn't have a son of his own. And if Heli died before Jacob, then the nephew Joseph becomes the king of Israel. Or king of Judah, I should say.
Or the heir to it.
The heir to the king of Judah. He's not really the king.
Yeah.
But being that there aren't many surviving people in the family of King David. And I mean, Bethlehem at the time of Jesus was a tiny little town. Just a couple little families. Everybody would have known who the rightful king was. Everyone in that town would know, oh yeah, it's him. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone in Israel would have known it.
Right. Well, but there was another king of the time.
Yeah,
Why was
King
that?
Herod.
And what is his relationship to any of this, if any kind of relationship to it?
He was Idumean, and under, sometime, before BC, they converted to Judaism, and then somehow they're working with the Romans, and now they got these kings who are kind of Jewish, but not really. Okay, that's a whole nother story. The family tree of Herod is insane.
But it's no direct relationship to Jesus's family tree.
No, but when Joseph adopted Jesus, Jesus would have inherited the right to the throne. And when Joseph dies, Jesus now is the rightful king of Judah. And so Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Why did Pilate ask him that? That thing that they put on the cross, the king of the Jews. Why did they put that there?
Because people were saying that about him.
Because people were saying that about him. And anyone in the intimate circle of the family would have known. Just like, there's a king of Hawaii today.
But hold that thought.
Okay.
It makes me think of how a lot of people, when they're reading the gospel and they're not thinking about a king's list or whether or not Jesus is the heir to the throne, they are thinking about how there were a lot of his followers who were convinced he was the Messiah, who wanted him to take the throne. And so you would think that this is actually the Jesus supporters that were saying, I want him king of the Jews. Let's call him king of the Jews. And as a crowd, let's chant, he's king of the Jews. And then Pilate says, are you king of the Jews? But that's not necessarily what had happened. It was that there were people that were thinking
that he should be the king of the Jews. And that filters out to the crowds, and Romans are like, oh no. So he asks them, are you? He says, you say that I am. He really was.
Before we continue, a quick heads up. Stick around until the end of the interview, where we'll be offering an exclusive free ebook, the Creation Answers book, packed with biblical answers to over 60 important questions about creation, evolution, and the Bible. You won't want to miss it. Now back to the interview.
Old church traditions. I don't put any stock in them, but the old church tradition says that several of Jesus's apostles were his cousins. That Salome was Mary's sister. And so she, 2 of the apostles are sons of Salome. So there's, 2 or maybe even 4 who are traditionally associated with Jesus's family. They would have known. Something else interesting too. A lot of people say that Joseph, Jesus's father, was married before he married Mary. Because he disappears from the story, right? Everyone says, oh, he must have been an old man, therefore he died before Jesus was 33 and started his ministry, or 30 and started his ministry. But the Bible doesn't say that. Some other people, when you read about brothers and sisters of Jesus, that can't be Mary's, because Mary and Joseph never had any children other than Jesus, who wasn't Joseph's child. It's a very Catholic,
Really? So
the Catholic
okay.
idea, right? Mary, the perpetual virgin.
Huh.
But if Jesus is Joseph's younger son, then one of his older brothers would have inherited the right to the throne.
Right.
If, on the other hand, these sons and daughters are actually Joseph's sons and daughters, they're younger than Jesus, they don't inherit the right to the throne. So, yeah, it really does look like Jesus had brothers and sisters, and they're Joseph and Mary's children. Jesus was first. So there's all sorts of really interesting theology that comes out of this. All sorts of fascinating things that, and honestly, I mean, how many times do you read through First Chronicles and understood all the names? I do my daily Bible reading every year pretty much, and I usually listen to it. And you get to that section,
you can't follow.
I can't follow it. But I have sat down with a chart and written these names out and put them in Excel and put them in PowerPoint and try to figure things out, just because that's kind of nerdy, kind of genealogist person I am. Most people don't like stuff like that. So what you and I just did, I hope, we've just done a 10,000-foot view, hit some of the highlights, and said why this is important. So going back a little bit, I said something about the king of Hawaii.
Yes.
There are a number of kings and queens of things that don't exist anymore. But the family certainly knows who the supposed king and queen is. I mean, there's a king of France today.
Makes sense, yeah.
There's a king of all and queens of all different things that the situation politically has changed, and yet the family is still, they know who the rightful king or queen is. The Jews, I'm suggesting, also knew. And
Makes perfect sense.
They were tracking that over time. And then when Joseph inherited the right to the throne and gave that right to his adopted child from a woman who got pregnant out of wedlock, that would have caused a lot of raised eyebrows, shall we say.
Mm. Yes.
And yet, Matthew mentions Ruth, Rahab, Bathsheba, Mary, 4 women who are righteous women. No sins attributed to them, but all of them have questionable circumstances, shall we say.
Yeah.
So he's not afraid to do that. That this is pointing at, humans being frail, humans being sinful, and yet Jesus being adopted into that kingship, just like we get to be adopted into Jesus's kingship. Joseph called Jesus his son. Jesus is the King of the Jews. Jesus is the Messiah. And that King of the Jews, that Messiah, has adopted his children in also. It's a beautiful picture.
Yeah.
We don't deserve to be called the children of Jesus. And he calls us it anyway. I mean, literally, the King, the promised Messiah. I mean, promised all the way back in the Garden of Eden. Promised to Abraham, promised to Isaac, promised to Jacob, promised to David, is Jesus the Christ.
And the implications for all of this is that the Gospels are reliable.
Yeah, there's no glaring error in the scriptures here. Now, again, we don't necessarily know what the exact answer is, but that doesn't matter. There's multiple potential answers, meaning we can just relax. This is not a glaring problem. The early church understood this. They believed it. They took these dissimilar lists and put them into the same book, and they didn't have a problem with it, so we shouldn't have a problem with it also. Therefore, we can believe the claims of Jesus.
Now, a lot of the listeners are probably not actually familiar with what the gospel is.
Oh, yeah.
That we've been describing everything that points to why the gospel can be deemed reliable, but maybe they don't know who Jesus is.
Yeah.
Can you give us the story?
For a long time in my Christianity, people talked about the gospel, but I didn't know what it meant. And when someone said, "What's your gospel testimony?" or explain the gospel, I would hem and haw, and I couldn't come out in words, but it's really simple. And it is that we sinful, fallen human beings cannot enter into the presence of the perfect, holy God. In fact, God demands, all the way back in the Garden of Eden, the punishment for sin is death. We're not stepping into his presence. But Jesus came to this earth, the Son of God, God himself, lived a perfect life, and then died in our place. When he's hanging on the cross, he's paying for our sins. He's taking on the death that we deserve. So therefore, death is no longer applied to us. And now we can go to heaven, live with God for eternity because the penalty has been paid. That's my basic explanation of what the gospel is, that we can now be united with God in heaven because Jesus was a substitute and paid the death that we deserved.
Rob, this has been an extraordinary conversation, and a lot of people will probably hear in these details for the first time. If they found this answer to be intriguing, the truth is that we want to share with them the answers to so many other important questions that are raised concerning the Bible and our research. So we have a book recommendation for them.
Yes, we do. This is the Creation Answers book. This is the most important thing probably that Creation Ministry does. Years ago, decades ago, our scientists and speakers sat down and they made a list of all the questions that they get. And they've ranked them from the most common to the least common. And they took the 60 most asked questions, which was 99% of the questions. And they put them into one book. And we're going to make this available for free as a digital download, just because we want to get this into people's hands. And just on the back here, we have 20 chapters. Does God exist? Really 6 days? What about the gap theory? What about carbon dating? How can you see distant starlight in a young universe? There's questions here about Noah's Ark, about the flood, the ice age, weird things like aliens, questions about dinosaurs. It's the most asked questions, and we put it into one book. I mean, there's amazing stuff in here. You can look up a question and then just go to that particular place and get an answer, or you can read it like a lot of other people have done, just read it from cover to cover. It's a wonderful resource, and we want to make this available to our listeners and to our watchers as a free ebook.
And if you want to get a copy of the free ebook, you need to follow the link in the description. Rob, thank you so much. This has been great.
You're welcome. I just hope we've encouraged some people to dig into the Bible and shown people that the Bible actually is true. It is the Word of God, and Jesus, therefore, is the Messiah.